Brian Stevenson was a Harvard-trained attorney. After one particular long day at work, he got home, pulled up his car in front of the new place in his new home in Atlanta, and he was listening to some music. And you know how it is when something's just kind of on your mind or you've had a long day at work, and music can sometimes just totally change your mood. Well, he was listening to some awesome music. And so he didn't get right out of his car. And then the next song that came on was equally as good. So about 10 to 15 minutes after just enjoying the music, he was ready to get out of his car when all of a sudden a police car pulled up right behind his parked car. Again, he's right in front of his house. And he thought, this is odd. I wonder why they're here. I'm not parked illegally. I haven't done anything illegal. I'll get out of the car and explain that to them and let them know that this is my car and this is my house. So anyway, as he's getting out, two police officers point rifles at his head and tell him that they will blow his head off if he doesn't do what he tells them to do, or what they tell him to do. He's kind of shocked because he just thought, I was just sitting in my car listening to music. Well, they throw him up against his car and illegally search it for about 15 minutes while the entire neighborhood watches this new neighbor being basically frisked and have his whole car checked for drugs and illegal weapons. After about 15, 20 minutes, they tell him that he's free to go. They didn't find anything illegal, and he's just kind of rolling his eyes like, what is this all about? And then they say to him, you're lucky, you know. So Brian happens to be black, African American, and he was thinking that the only crime he committed was being black. He was simply driving home, listening to music, and apparently a white neighbor saw a black man sitting in the car and got a little nervous, so called the police, and that's how they treated him. It was a little shocking reading this. He wrote the foreword to Jim Wallace's book about racism in America, the one we're going to look at for our book group, America's Original Sin. And in the book, he says at the end of the foreword, I considered myself lucky. I survived. And I thought, wow, that is rather shocking. So I wanted to share with you a few things about the book that I really enjoyed. And one of the things is that Jim Wallace tends not to group people together and judge everybody in that group based upon what people say or think about the group, whether he's talking about people of a certain skin color or a certain career or whatever. In fact, when he talks about police officers, he's just as quick to talk about the good police officers that make a difference in their communities and in a positive way, and the police chiefs and the mayors and the people that are our public servants that do a great job. But he's also very clear about the fact that we have a problem of racism in our country. Another thing I really like about the book is how he spends time with the people he writes about. And I wish that more of the people that write about contemporary issues would do that. He actually has spent way more time with people of color than any other author I know. And I'll get to that, I think, a little bit more in my message today. But one of the things that stood out was that he has asked literally hundreds of African American parents if they've had the talk with all of their children that are teenagers. And the talk is, especially if the parents are raising boys, here's how to survive an encounter with a police officer. And they're serious. Here's how you live through it. 100% of the hundreds of people he's asked who are African American all said, of course we've had that conversation with our sons. We want them to live. He also asked hundreds of people who are Caucasian, have any of you ever had the talk with your kids? Not a one. Not one. 100% of black parents have this talk with their sons and many with their daughters. 0 white folks have this same talk with their kids. So he's basically pointing out we have a big problem in our society, and especially in our cities, where there's a lot of segregation and a lot of prejudice going on. The third thing I really like about the book is how it's evidence-based. He talks about statistics and backs them up. And he talks about the people he's encountered and had conversations with, and he writes it down. It's not just, oh, here's what I think about those people. He spends time with them, and he does his research. I will never remember some of these statistics, so I'm going to read them to you, in part because they're important, but also, to me, they're absolutely mind-boggling. This was so helpful for me because I've always known we've had a problem with racism in our country, but this just helped clarify it so much for me. So, I'm going to read to you just a number of statistics, and this first one has to do with our nation's inclination to lock people up for the purposes of punishment rather than rehabilitation, or for that matter, even fairness. So the quote is, although the United States has 5% of the world's population, it contains nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that for a moment. 1/4 of all prisoners in the world are in our country, or in prisons maybe overseas that our country oversees, military-wise and otherwise. Number 2, second quote, this represents a 500% increase in the total number of prisoners over the last 40 years. So since the 1970s, 5 times more people in prison. And Jim Wallace says very clearly, and he backs this up, this is not due to rising crime rates, but rather changes in sentencing law and policy. I think the most disturbing statistic that I read in the book that has to do with racial disparity in the criminal justice system is this one. There are more African American adults under correctional control today than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. Let that settle in for a moment. In case you missed it, there are more black people today in our prisons and jails and on probation and parole than there were slaves of African American descent right before the Civil War. And Jim Wallace goes on to say what a difference this makes in our society, because these people who have been to prison, even after they get out, they're unable to vote, they're unable to serve on juries, they're unable to secure decent jobs and housing, and many are unable to access public benefits that most of us just take for granted. It's as if we have enslaved an entire race all over again and just called it something else. There are people who say, well, maybe black people just commit more crimes than white people, or maybe the people of color are a much greater threat to our society. However, the statistics don't back that up one bit. Since most of African Americans who are in prison today are there because of drug-related offenses, let's look at some of those statistics. So Michelle Alexander is a professor at Union Theological Seminary. I think she's still just a visiting professor, but still a professor at one of the great seminaries of our country, and also an expert on racism and an author. And she writes from extensive studying this quote, studies consistently show that people of all colors use and sell drugs at remarkable similar rates. And she calls the war on drugs, the so-called war on drugs, for this reason. Politicians claim that the enemy in this war is a thing, drugs, not a group of people. But the facts prove otherwise. In some states, she goes on to write, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been African Americans, even though the majority of illegal drug users and dealers there are white. Think about that. And then she says, in the U.S. as a whole, in our country, 3/4 of all people imprisoned for drug offenses have been black or Latino, even though there's no indication whatsoever that they use more drugs than Caucasians. And then, to point out how sentencing laws and policies are grossly unfair, Michelle Alexander goes on to compare drunk driving arrests and drug arrests, as well as alcohol to illegal drugs in general. She says at the close of the 1970s, about the time when the war on drugs began, overall alcohol-related deaths were close to 100,000 a year. I actually thought they would be quite a bit higher. By contrast, she goes on to write, the total of all drug-related deaths was 21,000 annually. So 5 times more people died at that time from alcohol rather than drugs. And yet, our politicians told us back then that we need to keep our streets safer. And speaking of keeping our streets safer, Michelle Alexander says this, while drunk driving arrests result in a few days in prison, possibly, possession of a tiny amount of crack carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years in federal prison. In fact, some people are serving life sentences for minor drug offenses and sometimes for first offenses. And then, of course, she goes on to say that there's no difference in terms of statistics, in terms of white people versus black people versus Latino actually using drugs. In fact, I think the rate is actually higher for people who are not black in terms of selling drugs. White men comprise 78% of the arrests for drunk driving when the new mandatory minimums for the offense were being adopted. And she says they are generally charged with misdemeanors and typically receive sentences involving fines, license suspensions, and community service. She goes on to say that in African American communities, in schools and in housing projects, SWAT teams actually swarm in to where African Americans live, and without any reasonable reason for doing this, they search everybody's car, everybody's locker, everybody's home, and anytime there's the smallest amount of drugs found, they arrest those people, and most of them end up in jails and prisons. But we never hear about this happening in white communities at all. So anyway, this is just to give you kind of an idea of the problem that's out there, but also how eye-opening it can be when you look at the statistics and the facts, and you let go of all those other things you may have heard about who's really dangerous or what our politicians are doing or whatever. By the way, one of the reasons I really like this book is it's a few years old. It was when President Obama was actually our president, because some people will say, oh, he's just one of those people that are, beating up on our president currently. And Jim Wallace has been talking about racism for decades. I'm hoping that you're not hearing me and saying, well, why even bother? It seems hopeless. One of the reasons I like this book so much, America's Original Sin, is because it's filled with hope. And Jim Wallace believes that there are some simple things we can do. There's also probably some more challenging things, but there's a lot of simple things we can do to make the issues and problems and challenges of racism in our country just go away. However, we as human beings, as I mentioned earlier in the service, have a tendency not to like the simple solutions. If it's not difficult, it's probably not going to work. In fact, if it's not difficult, I might not even want to get involved. We have a tendency, I think, of not embracing the simple solutions. And I think that this morning's Old Testament lesson is a classic example of that. We have Naaman, who is the commander of the king of Aram's army. Now, at the time, the Arameans were a great nation. Israel and others around them feared them because of their army. Naaman was the person responsible for that. And I will just tell you that in the kingdom of Aram, he was right below the king and the sons of the king, the heirs to the throne. He was probably one of the top 10 most important people in the kingdom. We don't know how many sons the king had, so we don't know what number to give him, but he was one of the most important persons in the kingdom. But the problem was he had leprosy, and he and the king knew it. And the challenge was, would the king be able to keep such a strong army without Naaman? And obviously, because of the leprosy, he wouldn't be able to be around very much. Well, then there's this little servant girl who's on the opposite end of the social spectrum. For one thing, she remains nameless throughout the story. She's a girl, she's a servant, she's a foreigner, and in that time, if Naaman wanted to, he probably would have killed her right in front of everybody else and not suffered any consequences whatsoever. That's how low on the totem pole this young girl was, and how Naaman was just at the opposite end of importance. So anyway, this little girl, though, tells her mistress, who is Naaman's wife, there's actually a prophet in Samaria who is known all throughout Israel for being able to help people like your husband. And so, the wife tells Naaman, the little girl here seems to think that there's a prophet in Samaria that can actually help you with your leprosy. And so Naaman ends up going to Elisha's house. And Elisha, just like Elijah before him, were like the two superheroes of the Old Testament prophets. They're known as miracle workers and just full of God's power. And so Naaman goes to Elisha's house, and typically what happens if a great warrior of one of the mightiest kingdoms on earth that you know of approaches your home, you come out with your entire household and you bow down. But that's not what happened. Elijah sent his servant out to Naaman. Elisha sent his servant and said, all you have to do is go to the Jordan River over here and wash 7 times, and your leprosy will disappear. And Naaman was furious. First of all, Elisha should have been the one to come out and tell him. And Elisha and all of his household should have come out and bowed down to him. And Elisha should have performed something great there in front of all the people to see, so that they would all know that Naaman and the king of Aram were on God's side. But instead, Elisha sends a servant out and tells him to go down to a river by himself probably and just wash 7 times. And he's furious. It should be more complicated. And in his mind, all of the really important things in life happen through extensive planning and strategy, considering all the losses and considering all your options, and then just making a decision based on all that and hoping that it's going to work. And yet Elisha said, just go down to the river, wash 7 times. Well, Naaman is furious. And luckily, he has a very courageous warrior that's traveling with him that says, Naaman, if he asked you to do something really difficult, you would do it, wouldn't you? Why not do the simple thing? Because what if it works? And so Naaman, I'm imagining he's rolling his eyes and thinking, okay, I'll give it a try, but there's all these other rivers, greater rivers I could have gone to that were closer. Why do I have to come all the way down to this little river called the Jordan? And so anyway, he goes down and he washes 7 times and he's cured of leprosy. And then he goes back and praises God, and he's very grateful. And it's really a story for me about how the very simple things in life we reject. They just seem too easy. Well, in Jim Wallace's book, he gives us some really simple things to do. And yet many of us don't do those things in our country. The first thing that stands out to me is people need to spend time together, people of different ethnicities, of different cultures. And when they do that, the problems of racism aren't that big because you're talking about people who you have grown to understand and love. Now, as I was thinking about that here in Hawaii, I thought, this doesn't apply to us as much. There's racism in Hawaii, don't get me wrong. But in many communities on the mainland, there are neighborhoods that are completely African American, completely white, completely Latino, completely whatever, and the people never mix. And they talk about each other as the other. And here in Hawaii, we're a lot more mixed up in a positive way. We have neighbors and colleagues and pastors and church members who are many different ethnicities. And I just think about the times I go to my own family reunions and there are Hawaiians and Chinese and Japanese and Portuguese and on and on and African American. And I just think, I feel like a pretty open person that doesn't judge people at all based upon the color of skin, but I'm with people like that all the time. It seems like our biggest issues are people who make judgments on other people that never spend time with them. I love how Jim Wallace puts into practice what he says we all need to do. When he was actually a young man starting out a family, he has two sons now that are probably teenagers by now, he decided to move into an African American community. And he became a little league coach there. And he's a pastor. His wife got involved in the educational system in the area, and his kids played little leagues, and they all spent time with African Americans. And as he tells the stories of what it's like being African American, he's actually telling the stories that people have told him, not things he's saying about somebody else. It seems like such a simple thing. If you want to get to know people and talk about people in a way that's meaningful, well, then you got to spend time with them. And like I said, I think we do that in Hawaii much, much better than many other places on the mainland. But a lot of people just don't seem to get that. And as I was looking at all those statistics that were just horrifying to me, new stuff that I just thought, wait a minute, more African Americans in the criminal justice system today than there were slaves before the Civil War? Who knew? Some of the solutions are really, really simple. Spend time with people who are different from you. There are many other things that Jim Wallace talks about in his book, and one of those simple things is churches ought to get together and talk about issues of racism. People need to say, well, here's what it's been like for me being on the other end of racism, or here's what it's like for me not understanding people of different colors or cultures or languages. And so our summer book group is actually an opportunity for us to do just that, to look at what some of the things are that we might do as a church and as individuals to overcome some of our biggest social issues of our time, whether it be racism or immigration, which is also talked about quite a bit in the book, or whatever the issue happens to be. But my invitation to you is if you're interested in any of this, starting next Wednesday night, we're going to meet at the parsonage, and we're going to talk about some of those things that are challenges for us and what we might even do as a church and as individuals to do some of the simple things that really make a huge difference. Now, there may also be some things that have nothing to do with racism or some of the big social challenges that are more personal. And so I also invite you to think of some of those things in your life. A simple little thing that you can do, like pulling on a light switch or flipping the light switch, that will make a big difference in your life and in your relationships. Remembering that most of the things that we can do to make life so much better for ourselves and the people around us are actually quite simple. Amen.